Todd here with Vineyard Canada Emerge. It was June 2015 when my wife Marianne and I and 3 friends found ourselves high above the Atlantic Ocean, overlooking the sunset on this gorgeous June day as we stood on the banks of Finisterre, Spain. Finisterre is the Spanish word for ends of the earth. It's the furthest most northwestern point in Europe, reaching into the Atlantic. After 7 days of trekking, we had been on a pilgrimage across northern Spain on the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James. And we had traveled each day until we reached the final destination, which is Santiago de Compostela, where the cathedral is, where the body of St. James is laid there. Then we took a ride after that time to the shores of Finisterre. We wanted to be where most of the world, up until 500 years ago, saw this as the ends of the earth. In their minds and in their hearts and in their geography, stepping out into that Atlantic was where the world ended. And so we sat on those shores with a lot of interest and a lot of thought and a lot of pondering. As we watched the sunset, we all began to get up and head back to our cars in the parking lot. We joined maybe 100 people from various cultures and nations as we all headed back together. And as we were coming down the road near the parking lot, I heard off to my left a woman in English yelling, "Help!" And she was waving her arms frantically. And as I looked at her, she didn't look in distress, and yet she was saying help and she was waving her arms. And so I continued to walk, as did everybody else. Nobody really approached her, and she continued to yell help. Eventually, she pointed in my direction, and I looked around to see if she was pointing to someone else, but it was, no, she's pointing at me. And so I walked over towards her, and as I got close, she was standing in 2 to 3 feet of tall wild grass. I looked down, and there was a man beside her overlooking a hole in the ground, maybe 3 feet in diameter, and he was flat on his face with his hands down in the hole, and I realized over a minute that he was rescuing an animal. And so I got down on the ground beside him and looked down, and sure enough, there was a wild goat in the bottom of this 5-foot deep hole. And he was trying to get it out, and it was fighting him, and it was stressed and distressed. And so I joined him, and we began to try to move this goat out ourselves, but it too fought us. And so eventually we got to the place where the goat itself actually just went limp. Just in a sudden moment, it just let go. It trusted us. And we knew at that moment we could do our rescue. And so he grabbed one front leg, I grabbed the other, and we began to pull this goat out of the hole. We jammed its feet in the edges and knocked its head against the side, and it still didn't fight us. It stayed limp and trusting. And eventually we lifted this goat out of the hole, got it on the ground. It stood up, shook the dust off itself, and ran off to join the wild herd. As we continued back to our cars, I kind of shook my head. I come to the ends of the earth to rescue a goat. What was this all about? And I pondered it for many months to come, a little bit stunned at the experience, until one day it began to make sense. I fast forward from that day in June to May 12, 2016. And that day I had a sudden collapse of my health, or the beginning of a collapse. All of a sudden I was hit with this unexpected nausea that would not leave me. I eventually was unable to move in the same way I had. During that time, those first few weeks, I was restricted in all kinds of ways. Abdominal pain was on the increase, intense pain and restriction of movement. And the doctors began to do all kinds of tests, thinking of all kinds of possibilities. And at that time, I was becoming overwhelmed by what was going on. And I was increasing in this chronic pain, and it was becoming more vulnerable with the uncertainty of what I was dealing with, when I felt like God spoke to me from Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 10, where he said, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you, and I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." And that passage became something for me to hold on to through this very long and dark time. For the first few months, I couldn't even focus to read. I wasn't able to. And when I was eventually able to, I picked up a book by Richard Rohr called Falling Upward. And it is one of the most profound books I've ever read. I read it very slowly and methodically because it was so rich with so much. And what I realized very quickly as I entered the book was that I had fallen in a hole just like this goat. And that goat story was really about me. It was God giving me an indicator that he would see this day coming for me, and that I needed to be rescued, and that I, like that goat, needed to figure out how to become limp and let go, which was the most difficult thing in that time. The rest of 2016 and 17 largely were me learning how to let go. I only returned to work a few months ago full-time here and began my journey into normal life. At times it was terrifying, if I'm really honest with you and with myself. It was overwhelming because they couldn't determine what was going on, and yet the chronic pain continued, the restriction continued, the lack of mobility continued, to the point where I couldn't even move 100 yards or walk 100 yards, where I could barely leave my home, where I couldn't drive, and I was stuck in this isolated place. The big question that happened for me through this time is, would I be stuck in this place? Was this the rest of my life? Would I get no further than this tiny little world that I had to be shrunk into, which was far from the world I've known most of my life? And so the rescue for me was a slow rescue. It was very, and continues to be very slow. I'm still not at 100%. And yet I could see God in it, and I could see God there. My head was banged against the side on the way out. Many of the doctors and many of the practitioners' advice and suggestions hurt me, didn't help me. Many of the ideas didn't really work. They hindered me. Often I felt like my limbs were jammed into the side just with everybody's attempts to help. Much of the help was hurting. And so it was difficult. I was trying to figure out how to trust in the midst of it. And I began reading further into Rohr's book, and he talks about the difference between falling and failing. And he talks about failing being a part of our choices. It's something we choose and we pay the consequences. And yet falling is another form. It's not necessarily our choices. It's the result of a larger picture. But falling is something that happens to in this life. It's a misstep, if you would. Rohr then references the Odyssey. If you know the Odyssey, it's the ancient poem of Homer. And he begins to explain falling through this lens. And he speaks of Odysseus, the main character in the poem. And he talks about after the fall of Troy, how Odysseus spent 10 years trying to find home, trying to find that place of belonging and trust. And on that journey, Odysseus had to lose many things. He had to go down, he had to go up, he lost his army, he lost his power. Many things were stripped from him in order to find home. And that was the case, certainly, that was happening for me. As I was reading further into the book, Rohr made this most profound statement that was a complete confirmation to me that God had seen me and he was with me and he knew the condition and the situation I'd fallen in. And Rohr goes on to explain the word tragedy. The Greek word tragedy is the word goat story. And I had to reread it several times and go on my own little search to find out if it was true that the word tragedy was goat story. How could that be? And so for me, it was a moment of saying, God, you saw this. You knew me in my tragedy. Rohr then describes tragedy in this way when he's talking about falling. He says, the gospel was able to accept that life is tragic, but then graciously added that we can survive and even grow through tragedy. This is the great turnaround, Rohr says. It all depends on whether we're able to see down as up, or as Jung put it, where you stumble and fall, you will find pure gold. Or as Lady Gillian put it even more poetically, first there is the fall, then we recover from the fall. Both are the mercy of God. For me, those words were like chicken soup to the soul. They were just settling for me and healing for me. And as I stepped back from my story, I realized that as I was face down in this dirt, unable to really move and couldn't see anything but my nose and the ground in front of me, I was able to come away with, at least at this point, 5 nuggets of gold from my experience of tragedy in my own life. And so let me try to capture for you what I extracted from my experience of going down. The first thing that I discovered was that life is about setting rhythms. In our Western culture in particular, we're insensitive to rhythms. We're insensitive to seasons. we sort of see ourselves as the dominant force in the world, and we really don't pay attention to the signs around us, and we plow through life. And that is seen in the amount of stress you see in people's lives. You see that in the amount of self-medicating that takes place in our lives, whether that's through food or all kinds of addictions, but things that overwhelm us, and we are needing to deal with them in unhealthy ways because we weren't built for a life that doesn't have rhythms. And so rhythms are critical. And as one who likes to plow through life, for me, the realization of rhythms went to a completely other level, and the acceptance of it as the way of life. Secondly, I realized that busyness has become the currency of cultural worth. If you're not busy, you're not worth anything. And often people will be busy just to feel worthy. And in my situation, I became marginalized to all of life. I was unable to join the highway of life. I wasn't going to work. I wasn't leaving my home. I was isolated day in and day out, except for to visit doctors and practitioners. That was all that I could do. I couldn't drive. And I spent many hours just trying to figure out how to get from breakfast to lunch and lunch to supper and supper to bed. The extent of my reach was very small and very tiny. I was isolated from people. I was isolated from my friend base. I was isolated from all kinds of things simply because of my chronic pain. And it made me realize how much worth had become in our busyness. And you can see this in the stress in people's lives. Third thing I realized is this deep longing for connection that is in all of us. Many of us lead out of our gifts and our strengths, and we step into our lives each day trying to win approval, build status, build our brand, build our reputation, all kinds of things, build our network, whatever it is we're doing, when in reality, we really just long for connection. And many of us will leave the end of a day starving because we really had no connection. We just were about building a brand or building something. And so it's important, and when we get stripped away from everything, to realize that that's really what's at the bottom of all of us. That's what we all long for. And we dress ourselves up and put all kinds of pretense around it, maybe for fear of vulnerability, maybe for fear that we won't be loved. And yet at the deepest place, that's what we long for. Fourthly, I realized the uncomfortable journey of self-awareness. When I think of self-awareness, I mostly think of learning about my strengths and learning about how to grow and learning about the things I do well. But often self-awareness is about realizing what we have to let go of. And for me, I realized I had a low grade of anxiety much of my life. I was like the roadrunner who was keeping just ahead of the coyote, trying to not be caught by the coyote of anxiety in my life. And if I could just keep one step ahead, I'd be okay. And eventually, it appears the coyote caught up to me, because all I was trying to do was outrun it. And I wasn't aware and didn't accept the awareness of that in my life. And so what are you not aware of that would be important? The fifth thing that I discovered while I was down flat on the ground was that suffering exposes our vulnerability. Now, there's nobody that likes suffering, including God. And yet He's masterful at taking even the most difficult, painful, and tragic things of our life and turning them into good if we'll let Him. And for me, I discovered that as I was in this place of suffering, and when I speak of suffering, I'm talking about chronic suffering. Most of us can handle pain, whatever form it comes, for a period of time. But when it's day in and day out and chronic and year after year or week after week or month after month, it begins to wear us down, and even the strong break down. And we discover in this place that even though the world encourages that knowledge is power, that education is important, and it is, that confidence gets you where you need to be, and all these sort of cliche and motivational moments, the truth of the matter is, in reality, we exchange lesser longings for deeper ones when we pursue power. It's really not power that we're after. Suffering requires us to seek trust, not power. When you are suffering, you have nothing but trust to reach for. You have no power. You're powerless. You're left powerless. And in those moments, the only thing you can reach for is trust and to let go. And that is some of the hardest things. It certainly was the hardest thing for me and continues to be a challenge. And the last thing that I feel I took away at this point in this journey is that receiving God's love lessens the grip on our illusion of control. And what I mean by that is we think we're in control. We think we have control over certain things, when in reality, most of control is illusion. We have very little control. And to accept that, it can be very difficult unless we know we are loved. And I think to the degree that we receive God's love, to the degree that we've let go into His love, is to the degree that we can let go of control. And so when control, the illusion of control, is exposed and taken away from us, we first gasp for air. We first gasp for some kind of way out. And then we find we have nothing but to let go into receiving His love. And so I encourage you, wherever you are in your journey, if you're face down in the mud, if you feel like down is down and you can't find the down is up, if you feel like you're stuck, if you feel like you're lost, I encourage you that if you feel like that goat in the hole, like I was, that there is a rescue in place. There is a rescue happening. But it will require for you to let go. It will require for you to trust. And I encourage you in that journey. It's your only way out, and it's the best way out.